I pulled into my driveway after a quiet weekend hunting trip and found my wife of 40 years standing at the closed front gate with a single weekender bag. My own son had looked her in the eye, told her the house belonged to him now, and said she needed to leave immediately. I did not scream. I did not break down. I simply picked up her bag, walked her right past his new locks, and set into motion a quiet plan that would systematically dismantle his entire financial reality. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where real accounts of patience, pain, and quiet justice find their voice. If stories like this one speak to you, I'd be glad to have you along for more. Just follow the channel so you never miss one. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something about knowing that people from all different places are sitting with a story like this one at the very same moment. A quick note. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. What carries the weight here is the message itself. Gloria and I purchased our plot of land when it was nothing but bare dirt and overgrown weeds. I framed the walls of that house with my own hands. I laid every inch of hardwood flooring myself. I built the sprawling rear addition and the detached garage so our son Derek would have room to grow up and thrive. I gave that boy everything I had. I paid his college tuition. I helped fund his wedding to Cassandra, and I made certain they never went without. About a year ago, Derek came to me with a stack of legal documents. He sat down at my kitchen table in a sharp suit and told me he wanted to help shield Gloria and me from estate taxes down the road. He spoke with such careful, convincing concern. He said that if something ever happened to me, the government would carve out a massive piece of the property, leaving Gloria in a difficult position. He proposed a quit-claim deed transferring the title into a trust with his name attached purely as a protective measure. Gloria and I were getting older. We trusted him without reservation. He was our blood. I signed those papers without a moment's hesitation, certain I was securing my wife's future. I never once imagined I was handing him the very weapon he'd used to destroy us. The full weight of that mistake landed on me on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. I was driving back from a 3-day hunting trip up north. The truck was running smoothly, and I was thinking about a hot meal in my own bed. But when I turned onto our street, I spotted a figure perched on the cold stone wall beside our driveway. It was Gloria. The autumn air was sharp, and she had her thin quilted jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. At her feet sat a single worn canvas weekender bag. I hit the brakes and was out of the truck before it had fully stopped. My heart was hammering. Gloria was shivering, her eyes red and swollen. When she looked up at me, the devastation written across her face turned my blood to ice. She told me that Derek and Cassandra had shown up 2 hours earlier. They'd brought a locksmith with them. Cassandra had coolly informed her that they were taking possession of the property for urgent renovations, and that Gloria needed to vacate immediately. When Gloria tried to push back, Derek simply produced a copy of the quitclaim deed I had signed, making clear that the house legally belonged to him. He told his own mother to pack one bag and wait outside. I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the heavy wrought iron gate. A brand new heavy-duty padlock gleamed on the latch. Another man might have started screaming. Another man might have pulled a tire iron from the truck bed and beaten that lock apart. But I spent 40 years running chaotic construction sites. You don't last in commercial contracting by losing your composure when something collapses. You survive by reading the failure and dismantling it piece by piece. My grief hardened instantly into cold, calculated focus. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned down, picked up Gloria's weekender bag, and took her by the hand. I walked her along the perimeter of the stone wall to the side gate. Derek and Cassandra had changed every main lock, but they had overlooked one critical detail. I built this house from the ground up. Years back, I installed a discreet contractor lockbox behind a loose brick near the utility meter, kept there for emergencies. I pried the brick loose, punched in the 4-digit code, and drew out my heavy steel skeleton key. I fitted it into the side door, turned it, and heard the solid, satisfying click of the deadbolt retracting. We walked into the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed dark roast coffee hung in the air. Derek and Cassandra were seated at my custom walnut dining table, the one I had built by hand, drinking my expensive coffee and spreading tile samples across the surface. When they heard our footsteps, both heads snapped up. Cassandra dropped her cup, mouth falling open. Derek shot to his feet, his face draining of color. He immediately went defensive and aggressive. He jabbed a finger in my direction and raised his voice, demanding to know how I'd gotten inside. He started throwing around words like trespassing, insisting he had every legal right to be there, and threatening to call the police if we didn't leave our own home at once. I let him yell. I let him put every bit of the man he'd become on full display. I didn't argue the legality of the deed. I knew the law, and I knew that technically my signature sat on that paper. Arguing with a fool only produces two fools. Instead, I held him in a silence so absolute and so cold that his voice began to falter on its own. I turned to Gloria and told her to go upstairs and pack 3 large suitcases, our most essential clothing and personal items, nothing more. She hesitated, searching my face with worried eyes, but my composure gave her something to hold on to, and she moved. While she packed, I stood in that kitchen and kept my gaze fixed on my son. The silence thickened until the room felt airless. Cassandra tried to look formidable, arms crossed, muttering that we should have seen this coming, that an old couple had no business rattling around in a 4-bedroom house. I didn't give her a word. I kept my eyes on Derek. I watched him shift his weight back and forth between his feet. He was sweating. He had expected me to beg. He wanted tears, or a fight, something that would let him feel superior. My stillness unsettled him in a way no outburst could have. 20 minutes later, Gloria came downstairs with the suitcases. I took them from her, walked to the front door, and stopped. I looked back at the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to ride a bike in this very driveway. A deep, irreplaceable loss moved through me, and then it hardened immediately into iron resolve. I gave him one final nod and said low and even, "Enjoy the house, son." I loaded the suitcases into the truck, helped Gloria into the passenger seat, and pulled away without once glancing at the rearview mirror. I drove us to a modest, clean motel a few towns over. It was a cheap place, buzzing neon outside thin walls, but it was safe. Gloria sat on the edge of the squeaky mattress and finally broke. She cried for the home we had lost and the son who had turned on us. I held her until there was nothing left to cry, and I promised her that everything was going to be all right. I promised her we were not victims. Once she drifted off into an exhausted sleep, I didn't lie down. I crossed to the small particle board desk in the corner, opened my heavy-duty laptop, and connected to the motel's internet. If Derek wanted to wage a campaign of legal and financial warfare, he had badly miscalculated his opponent. I had spent my entire career wading through zoning laws, property liens, and municipal codes. I pulled up the county property records database and typed in our home address. I needed to understand what was actually driving this. Derek had held that deed for a year, so why the sudden frantic eviction? Now I opened the public title history and scrolled through the recent filings. My eyes stopped on a document recorded just 3 weeks ago. The breath left my chest. Derek hadn't taken the house simply to live in it. He had leveraged it. He used the property as collateral to secure a commercial loan of $400,000. I dug further into the public business filings and traced where the money had gone. The funds had been routed directly into an LLC registered under Cassandra's name. She owned a high-end luxury boutique downtown that I'd gathered from passing conversations had been hemorrhaging money for months. The picture snapped into focus. They were drowning in business debt. Cassandra's boutique was failing, and Derek had used my life's work as a personal ATM to bail her out. He evicted us because the bank required proof of unencumbered primary residence to satisfy the commercial loan terms. Or perhaps they intended to gut the house and flip it fast for cash to bury their liabilities. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair, the blue glow of the laptop screen catching in my eyes. The shock of the betrayal had burned away completely, leaving nothing behind but cold mechanical strategy. Derek thought he had outmaneuvered a worn-out old man. He believed that by seizing the physical house, he had won the war. But he had just bared his throat. He had tied his entire financial survival to a commercial loan leveraged against a property I knew better than my own reflection. He had transformed our home from a stolen asset into an enormous, brittle financial liability. I shut the laptop as the first light of morning appeared beyond the motel window. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a contractor sizing up a demolition job. Derek and Cassandra wanted to strip away everything I had built and throw us out like refuse, funding their lifestyle on the back of our years of sacrifice. What they didn't understand was that the foundation they were standing on had already been rigged to give way. The quiet dismantling had begun, and I intended to see it through until there was nothing left for them to claim. The buzzing neon sign outside the motel window finally died as morning light bled through the thin curtains. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, listening to Gloria breathe. She had her eyes shut, but she wasn't sleeping. After 40 years of marriage, you know the difference between real rest and a person hiding from the world. I laid my hand gently on her shoulder. I told her we needed to be out of this place by noon. I promised her I'd find us a proper apartment that same day somewhere, with a decent kitchen, a solid lock on the door, and sunlight that didn't bounce off a dirty parking lot first. She gave me a small, brave smile that cut right through me. I kissed her forehead, laced up my work boots, and pointed the truck toward our local bank branch in town. The deposit money wasn't what was on my mind. Over a long career, I had built a very comfortable safety net. Our primary checking account held nearly $40,000 liquid cash, set aside for rainy days, unexpected medical bills, or emergencies. Precisely the kind of nightmare we were living through right now. That money was earned on early mornings, aching muscles, and weeks spent away on job sites. About 5 years ago, when the bank began pushing everyone toward digital platforms and paperless statements, Derek offered to help us adapt. He told me I should add his name to the account as a joint owner. He said he could help manage the more complicated online transfers and keep watch over things if Gloria or I ever fell ill. He was my only child. I trusted him with everything. I signed the banking paperwork without a moment's pause. The small bell above the glass doors rang as I stepped into the branch lobby. The air conditioning hit cold, and the room was quiet, filled with the low hum of machines. I approached the teller window. The young man behind the glass knew my face immediately. I had been cashing commercial contracting checks at this branch for decades. I greeted him and asked him to draw up a cashier's check for $6,000, enough to cover first month last month, and a security deposit on a senior living complex a few miles up the road. I slid my debit card and state identification across the polished counter. The teller smiled, tapped his keyboard, and looked at his screen. Then the smile disappeared. He frowned, tapped again, and leaned closer to the monitor. He asked me to hold on for just a moment, then pushed back from the window and went to speak with the branch manager. I stood there on the tile floor, shifting my weight. A cold knot was forming deep in my gut. When you've spent your life in commercial construction, you build a sixth sense for the moment a foundation is about to give. I knew before the manager had taken 3 steps toward me that the ground was already cracking. He came to the window, a man close to my own age, and looked at me with the kind of sympathy that makes you feel sick. He told me the account was empty. I asked him to run the figures again. I kept my voice level, explaining that there must be a banking error, that $40,000 had been sitting in that account just 3 days earlier before I'd left on my hunting trip. The manager angled his monitor so I could read it through the glass. The entire balance had been wired out to an external private account the previous morning. He pointed to the digital authorization on the transaction record. It was Derek. I didn't gasp. I didn't slam my fist on the counter or raise my voice at the manager. I simply stood there and looked at those green numbers on the screen. 0 Derek hadn't just taken the house. Seizing the property was a desperate business calculation, a move to rescue Cassandra's failing boutique. But emptying my primary checking account was something else entirely. That was an act of pure malice. It was a targeted predatory strike designed to starve us out. He wanted to paralyze his own mother and father. He wanted to make certain we had nothing to retain an attorney, with nothing to secure new housing, and no means to mount any resistance to his eviction. He wanted us completely stripped down, desperate, and at his mercy. The branch manager asked whether I'd like to file a formal fraud report with the police. I looked at him and shook my head slowly. A fraud report would accomplish nothing. Derek's name was legally on the account. Technically, he had every right to withdraw every penny in it. I thanked the manager for his time, retrieved my debit card, and walked back out into the bright morning heat. The pavement baked through the soles of my boots. I climbed into the truck and pulled the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet cab. I wrapped my hands around the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. My own flesh and blood had decided that Gloria and I were entirely expendable. He had looked at the woman who raised him as the father, who constructed his entire world, and concluded we were fit to be discarded with nothing. The sheer cruelty of it was almost too large to hold, but sitting there in the warming cab, the sting of that betrayal burned away the last lingering ounce of fatherly guilt I had left in my chest. Derek believed he had cut off my air supply. He had decided I was just a retired, trusting old man with no grasp of modern finance or hardball tactics. His own arrogance and greed had made him blind. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. He had forgotten that I spent 40 years going head-to-head with ruthless suppliers, weathering brutal economic downturns, and outlasting corporate rivals who tried to push me off job sites. You don't survive 4 decades in commercial contracting by leaving all your materials in one exposed, unlocked shed. I turned the ignition, and the heavy engine thundered to life. Derek had played what he believed was his strongest hand. He'd stripped away the house and the visible cash. He was convinced the game was finished and he had won. But he was about to receive a very permanent education in invisible wealth. He had no idea that the checking account he drained was little more than a decoy, a sliver of my actual net worth. He had forced my hand, and now I was going to reach for instruments he didn't even know existed. I put the truck in drive and pulled out of the bank parking lot. I wasn't heading back to the motel to deliver bad news to Gloria, not yet. There was an old friend I needed to see in the city. Someone who understood the law the way I understood a controlled demolition. I drove away from the bank and pushed straight into the heart of the city. I threaded the truck through dense downtown traffic and swung into a parking garage beneath a tower of glass and steel. This was where the real operators worked. I rode the elevator in silence to the 42nd floor and stepped into the reception area of Prescott and Associates. The receptionist rose to ask whether I had an appointment, but I moved past her marble desk and pushed open the heavy oak door to the corner office. Prescott was seated behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by shelves stacked floor to ceiling with legal volumes. We had known each other for 35 years. He was the attorney who helped me incorporate my contracting business when I was a young man with one dump truck and a mountain of drive. He looked up, caught off guard, to find me standing there in scuffed work boots and a denim jacket. But when he read the look in my eyes, he set his pen down slowly and used the remote to close the heavy office door behind me. I settled into the leather chair across from him and walked him through exactly what had unfolded in the last 24 hours. My voice stayed flat, and even the entire time. I described the locked gate, the quitclaim, deed the commercial loan, and the hollowed-out checking account. Prescott listened without making a sound. He knew Derek. He had watched that boy grow up running an Awone in my yard. When I finished, Prescott leaned back, pressed his fingertips to his temples, and began laying out our legal options. He began laying out a plan to file a civil suit, challenging the validity of the deed, and suggested invoking elder financial abuse statutes to stop Derek cold. I raised my hand and cut him off mid-sentence. I told him I had no interest in a drawn-out public court battle that burned years and drained us both. That was exactly how desperate reactive men fought their wars. I wanted something precise, a surgical strike. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and drew out a small, battered leather ledger. I slid it across the polished desk. Prescott opened it, and his eyes went wide. Derek had convinced himself I was nothing more than a worn-out blue-collar worker who got lucky building houses in the suburbs. He believed my entire net worth was locked up in that primary checking account and the walls of our family home. What my son never grasped was that commercial contracting in the 1980s and 90s was an absolute blood sport. You didn't last through those brutal decades by being trusting or naive. You survived by outmaneuvering corporate developers, burying crooked suppliers under mountains of paperwork, and anticipating every possible betrayal before a contract was ever signed. I had spent my life swimming with sharks. I knew exactly how to drain a bad deal dry. I told Prescott to study the figures written on those pages carefully. 30 years ago, I quietly established an irrevocable independent retirement trust. Every time my company completed a major municipal project, a shopping center, a hospital wing, a block of city offices, I channeled a percentage of the profit straight into that trust. I never told Gloria the exact figure because I never wanted her shouldering the weight of managing wealth, and I certainly never breathed a word to Derek. I wanted my son to build something of his own, to earn his own calluses and understand what a hard-won dollar actually felt like. I wanted him to become a strong man, not a pampered heir sitting around waiting for an inheritance. The balance in that hidden trust sat comfortably at just over $4 million in the highly liquid assets. Derek had drained $40,000 from a decoy account and genuinely believed he had wiped me out. I leaned forward and told Prescott I needed him to form an anonymous limited liability company before the close of business that day. I wanted it registered in a state with the strictest corporate privacy protections in the country. I made clear there could be absolutely no public paper trail connecting my name or his firm to this new entity. It had to be a complete ghost. Prescott studied me from over the rim of his glasses. He knew exactly what kind of foundation I was laying. He asked me what the ghost company was going to do. I placed both palms flat on his desk and laid out the blueprint. We were going straight to the secondary debt market. Derek had leveraged my home to secure a $400,000 commercial loan from a mid-sized regional bank. Banks offload risky commercial debt routinely, especially once a business starts showing signs of collapse. Cassandra had been flooding her boutique's social media with desperate clearance sales for months, and her profit margins were hemorrhaging cash. Her operation was a sinking ship, and the bank holding that loan would be eager to shed the risk. I instructed Prescott to use funds from my hidden trust to have our new anonymous company purchase Derek's commercial loan directly from the bank. I didn't simply want my house back. I wanted to own his debt outright. I wanted to hold the financial paper on my own home and become his sole creditor. Prescott had spent his entire career negotiating ruthless corporate buyouts. He leaned back in his chair and actually smiled. He recognized the play immediately. By acquiring the debt anonymously, I would have complete uncontested control over the foreclosure process the moment Derek missed a payment. And without the cushion of my checking account to fall back on, I knew that default was coming fast. We spent the next 2 hours drawing up the intricate corporate paperwork. I authorized the transfer of the required capital from my trust into Prescott's secure escrow account. We built the privacy shields, the registered agents, the routing structures. Every legal joint was reinforced and every potential loophole sealed tight. As I rose to leave, Prescott came around his desk and shook my hand with both of his. He looked me straight in the eye and said Derek had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I simply nodded. I walked back out to the parking garage and got into my truck. The cold knot of betrayal that had been sitting in my gut was gone, replaced by a deep, steady rhythm. Derek thought he had cut me off at the knees, but he had simply stepped into an arena where I had been fighting and winning long before he ever drew his first breath. I put the truck in gear and drove. Now all I had to do was wait for my son to finish tightening the noose around his own neck. The quiet of the new apartment we secured later that afternoon stood in sharp contrast to the roaring chaos of the construction sites I had run for 40 years. Gloria was in the next room unpacking the clothes we had brought from the motel. I stood at the large window looking out over the city streets and waited for the call. I didn't have to wait long. My cell phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. It was Prescott. His voice was measured and precise. He told me the wire transfer from my hidden trust had cleared in full. The anonymous LLC we had established was fully operational and heavily funded. More importantly, he confirmed that our offer to acquire the commercial debt had been accepted by the regional bank. The bankers were more than happy to lift a risky retail loan off their books. They asked no questions about the anonymous buyer taking it off their hands. They simply wanted the liability gone. Prescott assured me the paperwork was signed, sealed, and filed. I was no longer simply an evicted father. I was the silent holder of a $400,000 commercial loan. I held the sole financial leash on my son. I thanked Prescott and set the phone down. I looked out at the city skyline and let a cold satisfaction settle deep in my chest. Across town, Derek was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own decisions. He was certain he had secured his future by locking me out of my own home. But he had completely misread the brutal mechanics of commercial debt. I knew exactly how retail businesses collapsed. I had built the storefronts that housed them. Cassandra's luxury boutique was bleeding money every single day. She had signed lease agreements she couldn't honor and stocked luxury inventory she couldn't move. The business was burning through cash faster than they could account for it. Vendors were calling demanding payment on overdue invoices. Suppliers were yanking their credit lines. Derek was in a full panic. He had drained my personal checking account, thinking $40,000 would stop the hemorrhage. But $40,000 is nothing more than a temporary bandage pressed over a fatal wound in the retail world. The money evaporated within days, barely covering payroll and keeping the boutique's lights on. He was backed into a financial corner, with the walls pressing in. He needed a massive injection of capital immediately, or they would slide into total bankruptcy. That desperation steered him straight into his next catastrophic mistake. Derek looked at the 4-bedroom house I had built with my own hands and saw nothing but a towering pile of cash waiting to be converted. He decided he couldn't afford to wait for a traditional buyer. A conventional sale would mean a lengthy escrow process, bank appraisals, and home inspections. Derek didn't have months. He needed money by the end of the week. He reached out to a local commercial property developer who specialized in buying residential lots for cash. These developers were known for swooping in, leveling existing homes, and throwing up profitable multifamily units on the cleared land. Derek invited the developer to tour the property. He offered to sell the house I had spent 40 years maintaining at a steep discount in exchange for a 15-day expedited cash closing. He was prepared to surrender the work of a lifetime for pennies on the dollar just to save his own skin. Derek strutted through the hallways of my home, showing off the custom walnut finishing and the sprawling rear extension I had constructed. He pointed to the solid foundation and the modern upgrades throughout. He boasted to the developer about the prime location and the clean title. He smiled and shook hands, carrying himself like a savvy business tycoon, orchestrating the deal of a lifetime. He was convinced he had found the perfect escape hatch. His plan was to walk away with a substantial check, retire the crushing retail debts, and settle comfortably into a smaller luxury condo with Cassandra. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he never thought to look beneath the surface. He had no idea the regional bank no longer held his loan. He had no idea that every legal notice, every payment schedule, and every default clause was now entirely controlled by a ghost company operating solely on my behalf. He was proudly arranging the sale of a property while standing on a financial trapdoor I had already unlatched. I spent the afternoon at the small dining table in our new apartment, making certain every legal document was perfectly aligned. I reviewed the terms of his commercial loan with care. The covenants were brutally strict. If the property was listed for sale without advance authorization from the debt holder, the loan could be thrown into immediate default. If a single monthly payment was missed by even a day, the grace period was nearly non-existent. Derek had signed those aggressive terms because he was desperate for the initial startup cash. He never bothered reading the fine print, because he had always assumed my stolen money would be there to cushion him. I poured myself a glass of water and listened to Gloria humming softly from the living room. She was beginning to feel safe again, and that was all I needed. I had kept her shielded from the harsh mechanics of what I was putting in motion. I had no desire for her gentle heart to carry the weight of dismantling our son financially. She only knew that I had secured our future and that a roof over our heads was no longer in question. Meanwhile, Derek was celebrating his pending cash sale. He and Cassandra were probably raising glasses in my kitchen, toasting their own cleverness and the bright horizon they imagined ahead. They thought they had cleanly disposed of a burdensome old man and pocketed a fortune in the process. They were sprinting flat out toward the finish line, completely blind to the fact that the track ended at the edge of a cliff. I had no intention of stopping them. I would not pick up the phone and warn my son about the disaster bearing down on him. I was simply going to sit back, watch him charge into the dark, and wait for the precise moment to pull the floor out from under him. I parked my heavy-duty truck 3 blocks down the quiet suburban street from my old house. I sat behind the wheel with a cold cup of coffee, watching the front yard through a pair of field binoculars. I knew the developer was coming, because Prescott had visibility across the entire local commercial real estate market. My attorney had told me exactly when this meeting was set to take place. A gleaming silver luxury SUV rolled up to the curb right on time. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out onto the pavement. This was the local developer Derek had called. A notorious operator, known for descending on distressed residential properties with cash tearing them down or flipping them for enormous margins. He was precisely the kind of buyer a desperate man reaches for when he needs $500,000 before the week is out. The front door swung open and my son came out to meet him. Derek was wearing a designer polo shirt, trying to project the image of a man who ran with the big players. He grabbed the developer's hand and shook it with far too much enthusiasm. I watched every bit of his body language through the lenses of those binoculars. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He needed this sale to go through more than he needed oxygen. Cassandra was likely inside, pacing the hardwood floors and calculating exactly how many days remained before the boutique vendors pushed them into full bankruptcy. Derek led the developer into the house, and I could picture the tour he was running. He would walk that man down the wide hallways I had framed and insulated with my own hands. He would show off the custom walnut cabinetry I had sanded and stained. He would point to the sprawling rear extension, the soaring ceilings, and the reinforced concrete foundation. Derek was trying to sell my blood, my sweat, and my decades of hard labor to dig himself out of a hole his own recklessness had dug. And the bitter irony was that my craftsmanship was absolutely flawless. The house was a fortress. Any developer walking those rooms would see nothing but clean, untouched profit. 30 minutes later, the two of them moved out to the backyard. I had a clear line of sight through a gap in the wooden fence. The developer was running his hand along the brickwork of the detached garage I had constructed. He was nodding slowly, his eyes tracing the roofline and the property boundaries. Derek was talking fast, gesturing broadly at the open lot. He was pitching the dream. He was telling the shark that this property was a gold mine just waiting to be claimed, probably explaining that his elderly parents had relocated to a retirement community and he was simply looking to liquidate the asset quickly and free up capital for his own brilliant ventures. The developer drew a small notepad from his inside pocket and scratched down a few numbers. He studied the house once more, then fixed his gaze directly on Derek. Even from 3 blocks out, I could see the precise moment the hook was set. The developer nodded and extended his right hand. Derek lunged forward and seized it, gripping it with both of his. The relief that surged through my son was so powerful it reshaped his entire posture. His shoulders fell, his chest swelled, and a broad, arrogant smile broke across his face. In that moment, Derek was absolutely certain he had won the war. He believed the $500,000 payout was as good as secured. He thought he had outplayed a worn-out old contractor and made off with a fortune without facing a single consequence. He was already picturing the bank deposits, imagining the expressions on his creditors' faces when he settled the boutique debts in full. He was convinced he was walking away clean, leaving his mother and me to waste away in some cheap motel while he lived like a king. His illusion of victory was total and complete. The developer strolled back to his SUV. Derek trailed him like an eager puppy, clapping him on the shoulder and waving as the vehicle eased away from the curb. Derek stood on the driveway for a long stretch, staring at the empty street. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He was calling Cassandra. I could almost hear him telling her they were saved, that the money was coming, that their financial nightmare had finally lifted. He turned and walked back into my house with the swagger of a man who owned everything in sight. I lowered the field binoculars and set them on the passenger seat. I drew a slow, steady breath of the cool morning air. My son was floating on a cloud of unearned triumph. He had constructed a magnificent tower of hope soaring high into the sky. But he had no idea that a handshake with a developer means absolutely nothing until the county clerk's office runs a full title search. He didn't know that a cash buyer demands a clean, unencumbered property deed before a single dollar moves. I turned the ignition and the heavy engine of my truck rumbled awake. Watching him celebrate his hollow victory brought me no anger. I was profoundly calm. Letting him taste the sweetness of salvation was a necessary part of the process. You cannot truly break an arrogant man until you let him believe he has already won. You have to let him climb all the way to the top of that mountain so that the fall obliterates his reality completely. Derek was standing at the very peak of his false hope, breathing in the thin air of his stolen success. And come morning, the developer was going to run that title search and bring the whole mountain down on his head. Cash buyers move with terrifying speed, but they don't move blindly. A man who flips properties for a living does not hand over $500,000 on a firm handshake and a desperate smile. He calls his title agency. He orders a comprehensive public record search to confirm the property is fully unencumbered. Derek assumed the title was pristine because I had signed that quitclaim deed a year ago. He believed the legal slate had been wiped clean. He was wrong. In commercial construction, there is a weapon every seasoned contractor keeps in reserve for clients who refuse to pay. It is called a mechanic's lien. It is a legal chokehold. When a builder delivers labor and materials to a property and is never compensated, he can file a claim directly against the real estate itself. That claim clouds the title. It means the property cannot legally be sold, refinanced, or handed off to any new owner until the contractor walks away paid in full. The debt binds itself to the very soil and timber of the structure. 15 years back, when I decided to put up that sprawling rear extension and the detached garage, I didn't bring in an outside crew. I used my own commercial contracting firm. The municipal permits were pulled under my corporate license. My company sourced the lumber, the concrete, the copper, wiring the insulation. My company put in thousands of hours of skilled labor. But since I was building an addition for my own family, I never formally closed out the final municipal permits. And more to the point, I never paid my own firm the $90,000 in invoiced labor and material costs. It was a phantom debt, a dormant slip of paperwork, sitting quietly in my filing cabinets for a decade and a half. Derek never grasped what hard labor was actually worth. All he ever saw was the finished product, the beautiful rooms, the solid roof overhead. He never gave a thought to the intricate legal machinery that goes into raising a house from bare ground. The morning after he shook hands with the developer, I sat down with Prescott in his office and we brought that phantom debt back to life. We formally filed a retroactive mechanics lien against my old address adjusted for 15 years of accumulated legal interest. It was a flawless, irrefutable legal strike. The property was suddenly carrying an active catastrophic financial claim that superseded any recent transfer of ownership. I sat in the new apartment with a glass of water, clearly picturing the chain of events playing out across town. The developer's title agent would run the address through the county database. The red flags would trip immediately. The agent would call the developer and tell him the house was legally radioactive. A cash buyer chasing a quick turnaround wants nothing to do with a clouded title, especially one tangled up in an unresolved commercial construction dispute. The liability is simply too enormous to absorb. I knew the exact moment the developer picked up the phone and dialed my son. Derek would have answered expecting to hear about escrow accounts and closing dates. He probably had a pen in his hand, ready to jot down the bank routing instructions, while Cassandra paced excitedly across the hardwood floors. Instead, he got the cold, irritated voice of a businessman who has no patience for wasted time. The developer wouldn't ask for an explanation. He wouldn't offer to help clear the title. He would simply tell Derek the property was compromised, accuse him of trying to pull a fast one, and declare the deal completely dead before ending the call. The silence inside my old house must have been total. The grand illusion of salvation shattered into a million pieces in a matter of seconds. The $500,000 payout evaporated into thin air. Derek was suddenly standing in the middle of a beautiful custom-built fortress he could not sell, could not leverage any further, and could not afford to hold on to. He would stare at his phone, unable to process how his perfect escape route had just caved in beneath him. He thought he had stolen a highly liquid asset. I had surgically turned it into an anchor. The mounting debts from the failing boutique were still screaming for payment. The commercial loan was still counting down to its default date. He had no cash, no buyers, and no way out. This wasn't a screaming match at the end of a driveway or some emotional blow-up. This was pure, unadulterated tactical warfare. I had taken the very sweat and labor I'd poured into building that home and used it to lock the doors from the outside, trapping my son inside a burning financial structure of his own construction. When you back a desperate animal into a corner, it doesn't suddenly find its dignity. It bares its teeth and strikes blindly at whatever is nearest. I knew the exact moment the developer walked away from that house, my son and his wife would be pushed right to the edge of their sanity. The mechanics lien was a concrete wall they could neither scale nor break through. But I knew how Cassandra operated. She was a woman who had spent her whole life bending reality to suit her purposes. When the financial doors slammed shut, she didn't reach for a solution. She reached for a weapon. I got a phone call from Prescott late that afternoon. His voice was unusually tight-stripped of its usual calm courtroom composure. He had contacts running deep inside the county and municipal systems, and one of them had just flagged an emergency petition filed under my name. Derek and Cassandra had figured out they couldn't legally defeat the lien as long as I was the one holding the pen. So they decided to convince the state that I was no longer capable of holding one at all. They chose to go after my mind, my freedom, and my most basic human rights. Prescott laid out the sheer depravity of the report they'd submitted to Adult Protective Services. Cassandra had persuaded Derek to construct a completely fabricated and deeply disturbing narrative. They claimed I was suffering from rapid and severe dementia. They told the authorities my mind was completely gone, that I was hoarding assets, and that my actions around the property lien were the erratic, paranoid behaviors of a man who had lost his grip on reality. But the cruelty of their plan didn't stop at calling me mentally unfit. To guarantee the state would respond with immediate and overwhelming force, they needed to raise the stakes. They told Adult Protective Services that I was actively abusing Gloria. They painted a sickening picture of a violent, confused old man holding his frail wife hostage in an unfamiliar apartment. They claimed Gloria was in immediate physical danger and needed to be rescued from my supposedly aggressive outbursts. I sat in the quiet living room of our new apartment, listening to Prescott walk me through the lies my own flesh and blood had committed to official government paperwork. Taking my house had been a business decision driven by greed. Draining my bank account was an act of pure financial cruelty, but this was something else entirely. Falsely accusing me of abusing the woman I had loved, cherished, and protected for 40 years was crossing a moral line that could never be uncrossed. They were trying to weaponize the state against my family to steal my assets. Their endgame was brutally clear. If they could get a social worker and a judge to declare me legally incompetent, they could petition for emergency guardianship over my estate. As my guardian, Derek would have the legal authority to nullify the mechanic's lien, sign the title over to the developer, and have me committed to a locked state-run psychiatric facility while he pocketed the cash. He was willing to strip away my freedom and put me in a cage just to salvage his wife's failing clothing boutique. I looked across the room at Gloria. She was settled in a comfortable armchair, with a book bathed in the soft glow of afternoon sunlight. She looked peaceful, undisturbed. The thought of heavily armed police officers and skeptical social workers forcing their way through our door to question her safety made my blood run entirely cold. My son was willing to put his own mother through the trauma of an elder abuse investigation just to serve his own selfish ends. I thanked Prescott for the warning and set down the phone. What I felt was not panic. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds your judgment and makes your hands unsteady. What settled over me instead was an absolute freezing resolve. Derek and Cassandra had decided to play the filthiest game imaginable. They thought a retired old contractor would fold at the sight of a social worker's badge and the threat of a psychiatric hold. They figured I'd buckle under the weight of a state investigation and surrender my assets just to make the nightmares stop. They were badly mistaken. I had spent my entire career going head-to-head with municipal inspectors, city planners, and aggressive regulators who tried to shut down my construction sites over invented code violations. I knew exactly how bureaucrats operated, and I knew precisely how to dismantle a false accusation before it ever found its footing. I crossed to my desk and opened the heavy leather briefcase I had carried with me from the motel. I withdrew a crisp white envelope containing a document I had secured for exactly this kind of moment. I wasn't going to be a victim of a fraudulent welfare check. I was going to turn their dirty trick into the very evidence that would ultimately bring them down. The morning sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our new apartment, casting a warm glow across the polished hardwood floors. What I'm about to share changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who thought they understood the situation. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you the entire time, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth come out on your own terms? Gloria was at the kitchen island pouring herself a second cup of decaffeinated coffee. The air was still and carried the scent of roasted beans and fresh laundry. For the first time since we'd been locked out of our home, the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders had finally let go. We had found a sanctuary, a place where my son and his wife couldn't reach us. But a man who has spent his life raising commercial structures understands that peace is usually just a brief pause before the next load. Bearing wall gets tested. The knock at our front door was not a polite neighborly rap. It was 3 heavy measured strikes of a closed fist against solid wood, the kind of knock that commands immediate attention and arrives with the full weight of authority. Gloria froze, holding the glass coffee pot in midair. The color drained completely from her face. She looked at me with eyes wide with sudden terror. She knew exactly who was on the other side. Prescott had warned us that Derek and Cassandra had crossed a line and called in the state. But knowing a storm is bearing down on you and watching the tornado tear the roof clean off your house are 2 entirely different experiences. I laid my hand gently over hers, lifted the pot from her grip, and set it down on the granite counter. I told her to take her coffee into the living room and settle into her favorite armchair. I told her to pick up the novel she'd been reading and turn the pages as if it were any other ordinary Tuesday. Panic is exactly what they want from us, I whispered. We're going to give them nothing but complete boring calm. I moved down the short hallway to the front door and looked through the brass peephole. Standing on our welcome mat was a stern-faced woman in a gray business suit with a thick clipboard pressed to her chest. On either side of her stood two uniformed city police officers, postures, rigid hands resting casually but deliberately near their utility belts. They were not here asking for directions. They were here to execute a state-mandated intervention built on the malicious lies my own son had sworn were true. Derek had told these people I was a violent, disoriented old man. He'd painted the picture of a paranoid hoarder who had lost his grip on reality and was holding his frail wife captive. He had turned the legal system into a weapon against my most fundamental rights, all to seize legal guardianship and strip the equity out of my home. I drew a slow, deliberate breath and steadied my pulse. If I opened that door showing even a sliver of the fury burning inside me, the officers would read it as the erratic aggression Derek had reported. The trap was perfectly laid. Any ordinary man would have started demanding to know why police were at his door, and that very reaction would have been the justification they needed to put him in cuffs and haul him to a psychiatric ward for a mandatory 72-hour hold. I unfastened the deadbolt, turned the brass handle, and pulled the door wide open. The social worker moved forward at once, slipping her foot just over the threshold to keep me from shutting the door. She studied me with clinical, calculating eyes. She introduced herself as a caseworker with Adult Protective Services. She stated my full legal name and asked if she was speaking to the right person. I kept my voice completely even and confirmed my identity without a flicker of agitation. She did not smile. She told me her office had received a priority emergency report from an immediate family member. She stated there were severe, credible concerns about my cognitive decline and the physical safety of my wife. Given the nature of the accusations, she said she and the officers needed to enter the premises without delay to conduct a full wellness check and interview both of us separately. The two officers stepped closer, narrowing the space between us. Their eyes were already sweeping the hallway behind me, scanning for signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, the chaotic disorder of a hoarder's home. They were bracing for resistance. They expected a confused, frightened old man to start throwing accusations or shouting about conspiracies. Derek had wagered everything on this precise moment. He was sitting somewhere across town, counting on an unexpected police visit to shatter my composure. He needed me to fail this test. If the state found me incompetent, my mechanic's lien would be voided, my assets frozen, and he would be handed total control over my estate. He would rescue his wife's luxury boutique by selling my freedom. I did not block the doorway. I did not raise my voice or call my son a liar. I simply stepped back and opened my home to the authorities. I met the social worker's gaze directly and told her she was more than welcome to come inside. I offered the officers a fresh cup of coffee and gestured toward the sunlit living room, where Gloria sat quietly turning a page of her book. The social worker moved past me with her clipboard held tight. The officers followed, stepping into our spotless, well-ordered apartment. The air was calm and smelled of fresh coffee. No chaos, no violence, no confusion anywhere to be found. But I understood the real test had only just begun. The social worker was trained to probe, to ask the kind of questions engineered to expose cognitive decline. The next 10 minutes would decide whether I slept in my own bed that night or behind the locked doors of a state facility. I closed the front door behind the officers, sealing us all inside, knowing I had to play this without a single misstep. The social worker planted herself in the center of our living room. Her eyes moved from corner to corner, taking in the clean hardwood floors, the neat arrangement of magazines on the glass coffee table, the warm sunlight coming through the tall windows. The two officers mirrored her movements, trained to catch the subtle signals of elder abuse and mental deterioration. They expected spoiled food on the counters, unfamiliar odors in the air, the disorganized clutter of a mind that had come unmoored. Instead, they found a quiet, well-kept apartment that smelled of freshly brewed dark roast coffee and clean linen. Gloria gently closed her novel and set it on the side table. She looked up at the three intruders with a polite, mildly puzzled smile. She did not tremble. She did not shrink. She had the quiet, unshakable composure of a woman who had been fiercely loved and protected for 4 full decades. She asked the officers whether there was an emergency somewhere in the building. Her voice was steady and entirely free of fear. The social worker stepped over and introduced herself to my wife. She explained that she needed to conduct a private interview in a separate room. This is standard procedure in domestic abuse investigations. They separate the supposed victim from the supposed abuser to ensure she can speak without fear of immediate retaliation. A guilty man would have protested loudly. A controlling husband would have insisted on remaining in the room. I simply nodded, pointed toward the guest bedroom down the hall, and told them to take all the time they needed. I sat alone at the kitchen island, listening to the low murmur of voices drifting from behind the closed guest room door. I knew precisely what kind of questions the social worker was putting to Gloria. Was I raising my voice at her? Was I preventing her from leaving? Was I hiding money from her? Had I ever laid a hand on her in anger? I felt a brief white-hot flash of hatred toward my son for subjecting his own mother to questions like that. But I let the anger move through me and pass the way water moves through a pipe. I knew Gloria was answering every question with absolute flawless clarity. She would tell the social worker about the life we had built together, the home we had lost, and the son who had locked us out of it. 20 minutes later, the bedroom door swung open. The social worker came back into the living room, and the stiffness in her posture had noticeably eased. The two officers tucked away their notepads and shifted back toward the front door. They had already concluded there was no physical threat inside this apartment. The social worker settled into the armchair across from me. She clicked her pen and looked me square in the eye. The physical abuse investigation had just collapsed, so she pivoted to the mental competency evaluation. She walked me through a standard set of cognitive questions. She asked me to state my full legal name, today's date, the city we were in, and the name of the sitting president. I answered without effort. Then she asked me to count backward from 100 in increments of 7. I moved through it without stopping to draw breath. She watched my face closely, looking for the small hesitations or the nervous deflections that mark early-stage dementia. She found absolutely nothing but a razor-sharp mind. Then she closed her folder and leaned forward. She told me her office had received specific information about erratic financial behavior. She said my son had reported that I was filing fraudulent property liens and hoarding assets out of severe paranoia. She was testing me. She wanted to see if any mention of my son or the property would set off a delusional outburst. Derek was wagering everything on the hope that I'd start raving about stolen houses and ghost companies, making myself look like a lunatic. I did not raise my voice. I did not turn defensive. I looked the social worker in the eye and told her I was a retired commercial contractor. I explained that I had filed an entirely legal mechanics lien on a property I formerly owned because my firm had never been compensated for the labor and materials used to construct a large rear extension 15 years ago. I kept my account strictly factual, grounded in dates permit regulations and standard contract law. I watched the social worker's expression move from clinical skepticism toward genuine curiosity. I told her my son had leveraged that property to secure a $400,000 commercial loan for a failing retail business. I explained that he was now pushing through an expedited cash sale to a local developer to dodge default, and that my legal lien had successfully brought that transaction to a standstill. The social worker stopped writing. The pieces were clicking into place inside her head. She was beginning to understand that she hadn't come here to conduct a medical welfare check. She had been sent as a weapon in a high-stakes financial dispute, but I wasn't about to leave any room for doubt. I told her there was one more thing I needed to show her. I got up and crossed to the heavy leather briefcase sitting on my desk. I opened the brass clasps and drew out a crisp white envelope. I carried it back to the living room and placed it directly in her hands. I told her to read it closely. She opened the envelope and unfolded the thick document inside. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, not signed by a general practitioner, but signed and officially stamped by one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the city. The report included a full cognitive panel, a psychological assessment, and a detailed behavioral analysis. The medical conclusion was set in bold text. It stated that Earl Whitfield was in exceptional mental health, possessing a superior cognitive baseline with absolutely no indicators of dementia, paranoia, or cognitive decline. The social worker looked at the date at the top of the report. I had completed the evaluation exactly 1 day after my son had locked us out of our home. I told her that when a man spends 40 years anticipating structural failures on commercial job sites, he learns to anticipate the desperate moves of a failing business owner. I knew Derek would eventually try to challenge my legal competency to break the lien, so I built a preemptive medical fortress around my mind before he ever reached for the phone to call the state. The social worker closed the envelope and set it gently on the coffee table. She let out a long, heavy sigh. Every trace of clinical detachment had drained from her eyes, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable recognition. She glanced at the two police officers and gave them a quiet nod. The officers visibly eased hands falling away from their utility belts. They understood now that they had been dispatched to the home of a perfectly healthy, completely innocent couple. The social worker rose and extended her hand to me. She offered a sincere apology for the intrusion. She said her office was legally required to pursue every report it received, but that it was now beyond any doubt that my son's claims were entirely fabricated. She assured me the file would be closed immediately the allegations formally recorded as unsubstantiated and malicious. She added that submitting a false report to Adult Protective Services was a serious offense, and that a permanent record of my son's deception would remain in their system. I shook her hand and walked her and the officers to the front door. I thanked them for their time and their professionalism. I watched them move down the quiet carpeted hallway and step into the elevator. As the metal doors slid shut, I closed my apartment door and threw the deadbolt. Gloria came out of the guest bedroom carrying her book. She looked at me and gave a soft, relieved smile. The storm had rolled through and the roof had held. I walked to the kitchen island and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. A deep, settled satisfaction worked its way into my bones. Derek had thrown his absolute dirtiest punch. He had tried to cage me and strip away my freedom, but he had swung a sledgehammer at a reinforced steel beam, and the recoil was about to shatter his own wrists. He had handed me precisely the weapon I needed to dismantle his world. The defensive phase of this war was finished. It was time to go on the offensive. The morning after the state authorities walked out of our apartment, I drove back into the city with a single piece of paper inside a manila folder. It was the official clearance letter from the Department of Adult Protective Services. The social worker had been as good as her word. She had closed the case and formally documented that every allegation my son had made was fabricated, malicious, and wholly without merit. I walked into the offices of Prescott and Associates and moved past the waiting room without slowing down. I stepped into his corner office and slid the manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. I told him the defensive phase of our operation was done. It was time to drop the hammer. Prescott lifted the clearance letter and read it carefully. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. When a lawyer of his caliber is handed official government documentation, proving the opposing party lied to the police, it is like putting a lit match into the hands of an arsonist standing in a room soaked in gasoline. Derek and Cassandra had delivered into our hands the exact instrument we needed to bring their lives to a complete halt. I settled back in the leather chair and told Prescott to go to war. I wanted no polite legal warning. I wanted a brutal, overwhelming strike that left them gasping. Prescott drafted a sweeping civil complaint that same afternoon. He sued my son and daughter-in-law for defamation of character, malicious prosecution, and severe elder financial abuse. He laid out in precise detail how they had drained my personal checking account and then turned state resources against me to strip away my civil rights. But a civil lawsuit on its own can grind through the court system for months or even years. I didn't have months, and I had no intention of letting my son spend money he had stolen from me to retain a defense attorney. I needed immediate total paralysis. Prescott petitioned the presiding judge for an emergency ex parte injunction, a rare and aggressive legal maneuver reserved for situations involving an immediate threat of irreparable harm. Prescott argued that because Derek and Cassandra had already proven their willingness to commit fraud, emptying my bank account, and lying to the police, they were an imminent flight risk. He argued that if they kept control of their finances, they would move assets offshore or make the stolen funds disappear before we ever set foot inside a courtroom. The judge reviewed the evidence. He examined the cleared psychiatric evaluation, the dismissed police report, and the bank transaction records showing my son withdrawing $40,000 from my account. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He granted the emergency injunction immediately. A judicial order went out electronically to every major financial institution in the county. With a single stroke of the pen, the judge locked my son and his wife inside a financial vault and threw away the key. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. It landed on a Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of the business day. Cassandra was standing behind the marble checkout counter of her failing luxury boutique. Already drowning in debt and scrambling to keep the doors open, she was facing down a vendor who had arrived demanding immediate payment for a large shipment of imported inventory. Cassandra confidently ran her corporate credit card through the payment terminal. The machine beeped and flashed a bright red decline. She frowned, offered the vendor an apology, and reached for her personal debit card. She swiped it. Another sharp beep, another decline. Panic began crawling into her chest. She produced a third card, a shared credit line she held with Derek. Declined. The vendor stood there with his arms crossed, watching her with a mixture of impatience and contempt. Cassandra excused herself, retreated to the back office, and frantically called her husband. Derek was sitting in his leased luxury car in a coffee shop parking lot when the call came through. He listened to his wife explain in a rising panic that every card they owned was being declined. Derek told her to calm down, convinced it was just a temporary security hold the bank had triggered automatically. He opened his mobile banking app with full confidence, expecting to find the $40,000 he had stolen from me sitting safely in their joint account, and found no balance at all. What Derek saw instead was a stark administrative error message. His screen showed a notification that his account access had been revoked, and his funds were frozen pursuant to a court order. The illusion of his brilliant plan collapsed in an instant. Derek threw the car into gear and drove recklessly to the nearest branch of his bank, the very same lobby where I had stood just days before. He marched up to the teller window and demanded to know why he couldn't touch his money. The teller pulled up his name, and her face went pale. She called the branch manager immediately. The manager handed Derek a printed copy of the judicial freeze. Derek snatched it and tore through the dense legal language. His eyes stopped on the document's header. He saw the plaintiff listed in bold black letters. It was my name, Earl Whitfield, his father. The full weight of what he had done came crashing down on him. He had jabbed a sleeping bear, and the bear had just bitten off both his hands. He was completely locked out of the financial system. He couldn't buy a gallon of milk. He couldn't put fuel in his luxury car. He couldn't pay the angry vendors hammering on the boutique's door. And he certainly couldn't scrape together the massive retainer it would take to hire a defense attorney to fight my lawsuit. I had taken the oxygen right out of his lungs. He stumbled out of the bank and stood on the hot pavement utterly paralyzed. He had believed he was untouchable because he held my stolen cash. He never once considered that I would use the law to place that cash behind bulletproof glass, visible but permanently out of reach. But the frozen accounts were only the surface layer of the trap. The real horror was ticking away quietly in the background. The end of the month was bearing down fast. The massive commercial loan he had taken out against my house, the one now secretly owned by my anonymous company, was coming due. The loan contract allowed for no forgiveness. Derek stood in that bank parking lot with zero liquidity. He had no way to transfer funds, no means to write a check, no way to make his commercial loan payment. The trap I had engineered was airtight. I hadn't merely stopped him from stealing my house. I had constructed a situation where the law itself would compel him to hand it back. The balance of power had officially shifted. The arrogant son who had put his own mother out on the street was about to find himself at my door begging for mercy. The calendar on my kitchen wall showed the final days of the month ticking away. I sat at the dining table with dark roast coffee, watching the city traffic move far below. I didn't need to leave my apartment to know exactly how my son was filling his hours. Derek was stranded in a financial desert of his own design. The judicial freeze had brought him to a complete standstill. No cash to restock his wife's store, no money to retain a lawyer. He was suffocating beneath the weight of his own choices. But the real deadline, the one that would permanently break him, was almost here. The first of the month was just hours away. In commercial banking, there are no friendly reminders or sympathetic loan officers. The contract is the only reality that matters. Derek had signed an aggressive commercial loan agreement to put $400,000 into his wife's business. He had used my house as the collateral backing that debt. He assumed he would always have my stolen retirement funds available to cover the monthly payments. He never troubled himself with the fine print on missed payments. Commercial loans tied to distressed retail businesses carry brutal restrictive covenants. The grace period for a missed payment was exactly 0 days. The first arrived under a heavy gray sky. At precisely 9 in the morning, the automated clearinghouse attempted to pull the monthly loan payment from his frozen account. The transaction hit the judicial blockade and bounced immediately rejected for insufficient accessible funds. The loan officially crossed from active to delinquent. My cell phone vibrated on the granite counter. A brief, secure message from Prescott. He confirmed that the banking portal for our anonymous limited liability company had registered the failed transaction. The bait had been swallowed, and the prey was fully caught in the snare. I called Prescott and gave him one clear instruction. I told him to drop the guillotine. I instructed my lawyer to generate the formal notice of default and to immediately set the foreclosure process in motion on the property. My ghost company was stepping out of the shadows to claim its collateral. We didn't use regular postal delivery. A slow envelope through the mail wouldn't carry the psychological weight this moment deserved. I wanted Derek to feel the cold, crushing reality of the legal machine landing on him in real time. Prescott engaged an elite private process server. A tall man in a dark suit walked straight up to the glass doors of the boutique downtown in the middle of the afternoon. The store was empty, not a single customer moving through the clearance racks. Cassandra was perched on a velvet chair, staring blankly at the wall. Derek was standing behind the marble checkout counter with his face buried in his hands. The process server pushed through the glass door, crossed directly to my son, and placed a thick manila envelope in his hands. He confirmed Derek's identity, turned on his heel, and walked out without uttering a single word. I knew precisely what happened next. I had drafted every line on those pages. Derek tore the envelope off with trembling hands. He pulled out the heavy legal documents and read the bold text running across the top of the first page. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. The document laid out his missed payment in clinical detail and stated plainly that the holding company was exercising its right to accelerate the loan. The monthly payment schedule was terminated on the spot. The entire $400,000 balance, plus steep penalties and legal fees, was now due in full. The document was clear: if he could not produce nearly $500,000 in cash, within 30 days the property would be legally seized and auctioned on the county courthouse steps to the highest bidder to satisfy the commercial debt. Derek stared at the name of the holding company listed as the primary creditor. It was a faceless corporate entity registered in another state under strict privacy laws. He had no idea whatsoever that his own father was the sole managing director, sitting in a comfortable apartment a few miles away, pulling every string. Panic is a physical thing. It starts deep in the chest and climbs toward the throat. Derek was experiencing complete, total financial terror. He was powerless on every front. He couldn't sell the house to the local developer to pay off the debt because my mechanic's lien clouded the property title. He couldn't contest the foreclosure in court because his personal and business assets were locked solid under my defamation lawsuit. He couldn't borrow from another bank because his credit profile was actively collapsing under the weight of the default. He had burned the only family member with the resources to pull him back from the edge. The doors had sealed shut and the walls of the room were closing in. He had tried to take my home to bankroll his arrogant life, and he had stumbled blindly into a masterclass in commercial warfare. The financial trap had snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap. He had nowhere left to go. I knew he would come. It was only a matter of hours after that heavy envelope hit his hands. When a man has exhausted every last lifeline, his pride dissolves entirely. He stops being the arrogant businessman and reverts to the frightened boy who needs his father to fix what he's broken. I sat in the leather armchair of our new apartment and watched the rain streak quietly down the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gloria was visiting a friend across town. I had arranged it that way. I didn't want her to watch the final dismantling of our son and everything he had built around his ego. This was a demolition that belonged only to the two men who had created the tension between them. My cell phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. Not a call, a notification from the building's security application. Our luxury complex required all guests to be cleared at the front desk, and residents could pull up the lobby cameras directly on their phones. I opened the application and looked at the live feed. There he was. Derek was standing at the marble concierge desk. Every trace of the swagger he'd carried at my old house had vanished completely. He was wearing the same designer polo shirt he'd had on when he met with the developer, but it was badly wrinkled. His shoulders were caved forward and his hands shook as he gripped the edge of the security counter. I studied his posture through the screen, the way you read a stress fracture in a load-bearing beam. He was sweating the cold, clammy kind that comes from absolute financial terror. He had spent the last 48 hours calling every bank, every private lender, and every wealthy acquaintance he'd ever bought a round of drinks for. But the judicial freeze and the active foreclosure notice had made him completely radioactive. Nobody was going to hand nearly $500,000 to a man sinking under a fraud lawsuit. He had no one left to turn to. The irony bordered on poetry. The very father he had thrown out into the cold was now the only door he had left to knock on. The concierge rang up to my apartment on the intercom. He asked whether I would accept a visitor by the name of Derek. I kept my voice perfectly level and told him to send the young man up to the penthouse floor. I switched the camera view on my phone to the elevator lobby and watched my son walk toward the steel doors. He moved like a man marching toward a firing squad. He pressed the elevator button and rested his forehead against the cold metal wall. His breathing was labored. He was rehearsing his lines. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was assembling a fabricated narrative inside his head, working out one last angle to manipulate me. Derek was going to cast himself as the victim. He was going to claim some ruthless predatory lender had lured him into a bad contract. He was going to appeal to my 40 years of commercial relationships, the wealthy union bosses and developers I had built my career alongside, and asked me to arrange an emergency private loan. He was convinced that beneath everything he had done to me, my instinct as a father would override my judgment. He still thought I was the trusting old man who had signed that quitclaim deed. He had no idea I was the predator waiting for him in the dark. The elevator doors parted on my floor. The hallway security camera showed him stepping onto the thick carpet. He stopped and tried to press the wrinkles from his shirt. He dragged the back of his hand across his damp forehead. He was attempting to reconstruct the mask of a composed man, navigating a temporary setback, but the mask was cracked through. His eyes were wide with panic, and his jaw was locked so tight I could almost hear his teeth grinding. That long, quiet walk down the hallway must have stretched like miles under his feet. Every step was a surrender. Every step was an admission that his grand design had completely collapsed. He had burned the only family member with the resources to pull him back from the edge. The doors had sealed, and the walls were closing in fast. He had reached for my home to fuel his arrogant life, and stumbled straight into a masterclass in commercial warfare. The trap had snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap. He had nowhere left to go. I set my phone down and moved to the dining table. I did not brew coffee. I did not set out glasses of water. This was not a family visit. This was a foreclosure meeting. I placed a single crisp folder squarely in the center of the table. Inside it was the official notice of default, complete with the signature page bearing my name as the managing director of the holding company. It was the final nail in his financial coffin. I took my position by the large window, clasped my hands behind my back, and waited. The hallway was absolutely silent. Then I heard the sound of his footsteps stopping just outside my front door. I knew he was standing there, staring at the brass numbers on the door, trying to find the nerve to raise his hand. I could picture him pulling a slow breath, swallowing the last grain of his pride, preparing to beg the man he had tried to ruin. The anticipation sat heavy in the air, thick with the weight of justice finally arriving. He raised his hand. 3 slow, hollow knocks moved through the apartment. I didn't rush to answer. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, letting him sit in his own helplessness. The trap was set. The prey had arrived, and the door was about to open. The heavy oak door swung inward without a sound. I stood in the doorway and looked at the man who shared my last name. He was soaked through from the rain, his expensive leather shoes leaving dark, wet marks on the hallway carpet. The arrogance that had defined him weeks earlier, when he changed the locks on my house and put his mother on the street, was completely washed away. He looked diminished. He looked like a cornered animal that had just realized the trap had already closed. I didn't greet him. I simply stepped back and pulled the door wider, letting him cross into my new sanctuary. He came inside, and his eyes immediately swept the room. He took in the high ceilings, the pristine hardwood floors, and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked city below. For one brief moment, I caught a flash of raw confusion move across his face. He had drained my primary checking account. He had been certain I was holed up in some cramped motel room, counting out grocery money, finding me standing in a luxury penthouse in a pressed shirt, projecting complete calm, short-circuited every assumption he had walked in with. I pointed to the dining table and told him to sit down. Derek pulled out a chair and dropped into it. He dragged a trembling hand back through his wet hair, leaving it standing up in disordered spikes. He looked across at me with wide, desperate eyes. I sat directly opposite him. I did not offer him a towel. I did not offer him a warm drink. I rested my forearms on the cool surface of the table and held his gaze, letting the silence fill the room and settle like concrete. In commercial negotiations, silence is a vacuum, and a desperate man will always rush to pack it with his own insecurities. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he worked to steady his breathing. Then the words started tumbling out in a rushed, panicked rhythm. He told me he was sorry for the way things went at the house. He actually used the phrase, slight misunderstanding. He claimed Cassandra had overreacted and that he had always intended to bring us back home once the renovations were finished. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. He skated right past the eviction, the changed locks, and the fact that he had left his own mother standing on the sidewalk in the cold with a single weekender bag. I didn't stop him. I let him talk because I wanted to see exactly how deep his capacity for deception ran. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and shifted smoothly from a hollow apology into a fabricated tragedy. He dropped his voice, working to sound like a man the world had treated unjustly. He told me he had taken out a small business loan to help Cassandra with her boutique. He claimed the firm he'd used had turned out to be ruthless, predatory lenders. Derek spun a masterful web of pure fiction. He told me they had buried hidden clauses in the paperwork, that they had manipulated the interest rates and deliberately engineered a scenario designed to force him into default. He looked me directly in the eye and said they were trying to steal the family home. He actually used those exact words. The family home, the very same home he had proudly tried to flip to a local developer for a quick cash payout just days before. He was trying to weaponize the emotional attachment I carried for the house, hoping I would charge in to protect the walls and floors I had raised with my own 2 hands. He pressed on with his performance, claiming that the frozen bank accounts were part of the lender's aggressive collection tactics. He made no mention of my defamation lawsuit, the $40,000 he had stolen, or the malicious welfare check he had orchestrated to have me committed. In the version of reality, he was selling he was an innocent man, crushed by a corrupt financial system, a devoted husband simply trying to support his wife's business. He was reaching for my sympathy, while erasing every monstrous thing he had done to earn this moment. Then came the pitch. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple and asked for the bailout. He told me he knew I still had powerful connections from 4 decades in the commercial contracting world. He rattled off the names, the deep-pocketed developers, the union bosses, the private money men I used to share cold beers with after we'd wrapped up some big municipal deal. He pushed forward across the table, eyes wide with the hunger of a man looking for rescue. He wanted me to pull strings. He wanted me to arrange a private emergency bridge loan to wipe out the predatory lenders and yank the family home back from the edge of foreclosure. He was asking for $500,000, the same way another man might ask to borrow a wrench. I sat without moving, taking in the sheer audacity of his play. There was not one flicker of real remorse anywhere inside him. He felt nothing for the pain he had put Gloria through. He felt nothing for the contempt he had shown me. The only reason he was sitting at my table was because every exit had closed and he had run out of road. He was making one final attempt to play me for the fool. He had convinced himself that a father's love was a soft spot, a vulnerability he could press to wriggle free from the consequences of his own greed. I let him run the whole routine. I let him lay out every fabricated detail, every polished excuse until he had nothing left, and sat back in his chair, breathless, watching for my reaction. He expected outrage about these phantom predatory lenders. He expected me to grab my phone and start firing off urgent calls to old contractor contacts riding to the rescue of the family estate. He was watching me with the hollow, expectant look of a con man waiting for the mark to pick up the pen. I looked at the man on the other side of that table and felt exactly nothing. Whatever thin threads of fatherly feeling had survived were cut clean by his unrelenting deceit. He had scaled the full height of his tower of lies, and there was no higher ground left. I kept my expression completely flat. I reached forward and rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the closed folder, sitting at the dead center of the table. The season for listening had ended. The echo of his desperate invented plea still hung in the still air of my apartment. He had put everything he had into selling me that story about predatory lenders circling the family home. He leaned back in his chair, breathing through his mouth in shallow pulls, waiting for the gullible old man to toss him a rope. I didn't blink. I didn't shift in my seat. I let the silence draw out taut as a wire about to snap, until the atmosphere in that room felt like it was about to fracture. I watched the certainty drain from his face, replaced by something slow and creeping, the first cold edge of dread. He swallowed hard, the sound carrying in the quiet. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to stack another lie on the pile, but I lifted my hand barely an inch off the table. His mouth shut immediately, I moved that hand to the manila folder, resting precisely at the center of the table. No rushing. I moved with the measured calm of a man who has spent 40 years cutting, only after he'd measured twice. I opened the folder, folding the cover back and pressing the crease flat. Inside sat a single sheet of heavy legal paper, the exact same notice of default and intent to foreclose that a private process server had put into his shaking hands at his wife's luxury boutique earlier that afternoon. I set my fingertips on the top edge of the document and pushed it slowly across the polished surface. The soft drag of heavy paper over smooth wood was the only sound in the apartment. I slid it forward until it rested exactly 1 inch from his folded hands. Derek looked down, his brow creased in genuine confusion. He could not understand why his retired father was sliding him a copy of his own financial death warrant. He stared at the bold black heading. He recognized the document immediately. This was the monster that had pushed him through the rain and through my front door. This was the faceless phantom holding company that had acquired his commercial loan, cut off his exit, and moved to seize the house he had taken from me. He let out a slow, shaky breath, assuming I'd somehow intercepted his mail, or that my attorney had uncovered his financial collapse through public court records. He looked up with wet, panicked eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at the page and began to speak, his voice cracking between fear and desperate relief. He told me this was the exact document he'd been describing. He insisted this was proof of predatory lenders attempting to steal the estate. He begged me to look at the penalty fees. The accelerated payment schedule claimed it was illegal, claimed it was completely unfair. He begged me to reach out to my wealthy contractor connections and pull together the $500,000 bridge loan to pay off this anonymous company before they seized the property at the end of the month. I didn't look at the document. My eyes stayed locked on his face. I leaned forward, forearms on the table, and spoke for the first time since I'd opened the front door. My voice was low and quiet and carried the absolute freezing weight of a collapsing glacier. I told him to read the bottom of the page. Derek stopped mid-sentence. His mouth hung open slightly. He looked down at the heavy legal paper again. Confused, but he obeyed. His eyes moved down past the itemized list of missed payments, past the brutal default covenants he'd been foolish enough to sign, past the bold warning of impending public auction. He reached the bottom section where the creditor formally authorizes the legal acceleration of the debt. He found the printed name of the anonymous limited liability company that held the leash around his neck. Then his eyes dropped exactly 1 inch lower to the signature line of the managing director. I sat perfectly still and watched a human soul come apart in real time. I watched his eyes move across the letters of my full legal signature. I watched him read it a second time, then a third. The blood left his face so fast his skin went the color of wet ash. His breathing stopped entirely. The physical response was immediate and total. His hands shook so violently the heavy walnut table trembled with them. He gripped the edges of the document and pulled it toward his face, as though getting it closer might somehow alter what was printed on the page. The realization struck him like a wrecking ball driven through plate glass. The invisible, terrifying corporate entity that had bought his debt, frozen his cash sales, sealed off every escape route, and triggered the foreclosure of his entire life, was not some faceless institution. It was not a predatory lender. It was the man sitting exactly 3 feet across from him. He dropped the paper like it had burned him. He shoved his chair back so hard it shrieked against the hardwood floor. He clutched his chest, gasping, his mouth working open and closed without producing a single word. I was steeped in the absolute clarity of his unraveling. Every dirty move he had made had been turned completely against him. The stolen checking account, the changed locks, the police wellness check, the lies fed to the developer, all of it had amounted to nothing. He had never held the wheel. He had been a mouse running a maze that his own father had designed, built, and sealed shut. He looked up at me, and the raw terror in his eyes is something I will carry for the rest of my life. He finally understood that he hadn't simply made a bad business call. He had declared war on a man who had spent 4 decades burying hard-edged competitors in commercial concrete. He had tried to strip me of everything I was worth, and in return, I had methodically engineered a situation in which he was legally, financially, and completely destroyed. He tried to form words. He stammered my name, a weak, fractured syllable that barely made it out of his throat. He shook his head, unable to absorb the scale of the trap he had walked into willingly. He understood now that the money he was begging for, the $500,000 bailout he needed to pull himself back from the edge, was sitting securely in my private trust. He understood that I owned his debt. I owned his house. I owned his entire future. I settled back in my leather chair and folded my hands. I watched him suffocate beneath the crushing weight of his own unearned arrogance finally caving in on itself. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation. Only the cold surgical execution of perfect justice. The silence settled over the room again. But this time, it wasn't a waiting silence. It was the silence of a kingdom that had just been utterly and permanently conquered. The air in the apartment sat completely still. I watched my son's chest heave across the table as he fought to pull oxygen into his body. The full weight of his defeat had locked him in place. He was bracing for me to raise my voice to demand he answer for what he'd done to his mother and to me. I was the one who was supposed to erupt the wounded father, finally unleashing everything. But the anger simply wasn't there anymore. Anger is something you spend on people you still have feeling for. What I felt instead was the cold mechanical precision of a contractor running load calculations on a condemned structure. I settled back in my leather chair and began walking through the numbers. My voice stayed flat and clinical throughout. I told him to listen carefully because his entire future was contained in the figures I was about to lay out. I started with the principal balance of the commercial loan he'd taken to prop up the boutique $400,000. I added the aggressive default penalties that had triggered the moment his first payment didn't come. I added the compounding daily interest still accumulating on the delinquent balance. Then I added the extensive legal costs my anonymous limited liability company had absorbed to acquire the debt and push through the foreclosure notice. The total outstanding balance was now closing in on $500,000. Derek stared at me with hollow eyes. He shook his head slowly and begged me to simply take the deed to the house. He offered to sign the property back over right then and there. He said he would leave with nothing, surrender the house so I could move back in with Gloria and we could all pretend none of this had happened. He had misread the situation entirely. I looked him straight in the eye and told him plainly I did not want the house. I told him the home I had built with my own hands had been permanently tainted the moment he changed the locks and left his mother standing alone on the sidewalk. I had no intention of ever sleeping under that roof again. Then I explained exactly what was going to happen. The house was not returning to my name. It was going directly to the county courthouse steps for a public foreclosure auction. I walked him through how public auctions function. Foreclosed properties rarely sell anywhere near fair market value. They go to cash buyers and flippers, hunting for a deep discount. The house would likely fetch far less than the $500,000 he currently owed my holding company. I let that land and gave him a moment to absorb it. I watched him work through the legal implications of a shortfall. Then I leaned in and explained the concept of a deficiency judgment. When a foreclosed home sells below the outstanding loan balance, the remaining debt does not simply dissolve. The lender holds the legal right to pursue the borrower for the difference. I told him that my company intended to chase that deficiency judgment to the absolute fullest extent of the law. The color left his face all over again. I laid out the next 10 years of his life in careful, agonizing detail. Once the court granted the deficiency judgment, my attorneys would move immediately to file for wage garnishment. Every paycheck he earned a percentage would be automatically intercepted and routed directly into my trust account. Every time Cassandra moved a piece of clothing or worked a register at some new job, a portion of her income would be legally diverted to me as well. They would be working for me for the next decade. Every vacation they attempted, every luxury car they tried to lease, every comfortable meal they sat down to, all of it would be stripped away by the grinding reality of garnished wages. He was going to spend the prime years of his adult life paying me back for the privilege of trying to steal my home. They had wanted to live like royalty on my foundation, and now they were going to live like indentured servants settling the debt of their own arrogance. The financial prison he had constructed around himself had no windows and no way out. His credit was in ruins. His business assets were frozen under the defamation lawsuit. He was bankrupt in every sense the word could hold. Derek sat motionless in his chair. He looked like a man receiving a life sentence. He had no more lies left to construct, no more invented narratives to offer. The understanding that he had permanently destroyed his own life and his marriage settled over him like a heavy, suffocating weight. He finally grasped the true price of disrespecting the man who had given him everything. I pushed back from the dining table and stood. I told him the meeting was over. I instructed him to return to the house he no longer owned and begin packing his things. The bank had already frozen his accounts, leaving him no money to hire movers or rent a truck. he and Cassandra would have to carry their possessions out the front door with their own hands. I told him the county sheriff would arrive in 30 days to formally remove them from the premises, but with no cash for groceries or utility bills, I knew they wouldn't survive a week inside that empty house. I crossed to the front door and pulled it open. I didn't look back at him. I simply gestured toward the hallway. I told my son to leave my apartment and my life. I listened to the slow, heavy drag of his footsteps as he got up from his chair and moved toward the exit. He crossed the threshold with the gait of a condemned man. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. I eased the heavy door shut behind him and listened to the mechanical click of the deadbolt seating into place. The transaction was complete. 30 days passed with the slow, heavy certainty of a setting sun. The county courthouse steps were cold concrete under a harsh morning light. I stood quietly near the back of the gathered crowd, in a plain coat and a flat cap, blending seamlessly with the local investors and property flippers. My attorney Prescott stood near the front, holding the official paperwork for my anonymous holding company. The auctioneer approached the podium and read aloud the address of the home I had built with my own hands. A brief ache moved through my chest, and then it was gone. A young couple near the front raised their bidding paddle with nervous hands. The husband had the calloused grip of someone who worked for a living and wore a worn denim jacket. His wife held a small baby bundled in a thick blanket. They looked exactly the way Gloria and I had looked 40 years ago. Prescott had his instructions. He let the bidding climb just high enough to clear the absolute minimum baseline of the debt. Then he stepped back and let the young couple take it. They held each other and wept with joy. My old house was going to be full of life and love again. Whatever poison my son had worked into those walls was being swept out for good. Across town, the reality of that auction was arriving with full force. The sheriff reached the property exactly 2 hours after the gavel fell. Derek and Cassandra had exhausted every delay they could manufacture. Their luxury cars had already been repossessed. The boutique had been shuttered and liquidated down to nothing enough to cover only a fraction of what they owed their vendors. They stood on the front lawn in the autumn wind, shivering, surrounded by a sad pile of trash bags and cheap cardboard boxes. No money for movers. They could only watch as the deputies changed the locks and closed the door on the fortress they had tried to steal. They hauled what remained of their lives to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of the city. The building backed up against an active freight line, and the thin walls shook every time a train rolled through. Derek was forced into an entry-level sales position, working entirely on commission. Cassandra had to take a job standing behind the register at a discount retail clothing store. It was the deepest humiliation imaginable for a woman who had spent her entire adult life looking down on people for not having enough. And the most elegant part of their new reality was the mathematical precision of the wage garnishment. My attorneys had locked in the deficiency judgment. Every 2 weeks, when Derek and Cassandra opened their meager paychecks, they saw the brutal legal deductions staring back at them. A substantial portion of their hard-earned minimum wage was automatically intercepted and routed straight into my retirement trust. They were officially laboring to repay me for the privilege of trying to dismantle my life. The next 10 years would be spent clawing their way out of a financial grave they had dug with their own hands. I did not go to the eviction. I did not cruise past their new miserable apartment to savor the sight. Gloating is for small men who require an audience to feel victorious. I had achieved complete and total victory, and that needed no witnesses. That evening, I settled into a chair on the wide balcony of our new penthouse. The city stretched out below like a vast glittering ocean of amber and white light. The air had turned cool and carried the faint promise of rain. Gloria came through the balcony door, holding a small silver tray, which she set down on the glass table between our chairs. On the tray sat 2 heavy cut-glass tumblers and a bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch I had been holding on to for a very long time. She took the seat beside me, and I poured the dark amber liquid into both glasses. I passed one to the woman who had stood at my side through 4 decades of commercial contracting, punishing hours, and the ultimate betrayal of our only child. She met my eyes, and hers were entirely clear. Every trace of the fear and sadness that had clouded them on that terrible day at the front gate was gone. She was safe. We were secure. I lifted my glass in the cool evening air. I offered no grand toast. I did not mention Derek or the boutique or the mechanic's lien. I simply looked at my wife and gently touched my tumbler to hers. The soft ring of glass floated out across the city skyline. I took a slow, measured sip of the scotch. It burned warmly on the way down, settling deep in my chest like something finally returning to its rightful place. The silent adjustment was finished, and our peace was permanently restored. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I want to thank you for that. It means something to me. Looking back on everything the night Gloria and I were locked out, the months of carefully laying each piece in place, the moment Derek's face went pale, reading my own signature at the bottom of that page, I won't pretend it came without cost. There were quiet nights when the weight of it pressed hard, but I believe God does not leave the faithful without a path forward. His timing is not always our timing, and the justice that arrives slowly is often the kind that holds. Here is what this chapter of my life taught me, and what I would tell any man or woman who finds themselves where I once stood. Never let someone mistake your silence for weakness. The quieter your preparation, the louder the outcome. If someone moves to take what is yours, do not react, document, plan, and let the law carry the weight. Guard your full hand closely. What an opponent cannot see, they cannot counter. And if you are ever tempted to write off an older person as an easy target, understand that decades of hard experience is not a vulnerability. It is a weapon. This is a family revenge story that I share not to celebrate suffering, but because I know there are people in the adults 50-plus community who are facing something similar right now, isolated, doubted, pushed aside by the very ones they sacrificed for. You are not alone, and you are not finished. If this story reached you at the right moment, pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments, I read them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. There are more accounts like this one waiting for you. Thank you for listening, take good care of yourself, and I'll talk with you again soon.